Hello everyone, welcome to the third lecture video for Unit 5. Today we're going to start a long conversation about agriculture. Agriculture is hugely important to the human race and it is a big part of this course in this unit. But today we're just going to start talking about how it's evolved over time, what its impacts are, and the challenges that we face with agriculture. So if we look at the production of, this is coarse grain from 1961 to 2004, we can see that overall there's been a dramatic increase in both the yield and the production of crops across the world over the past 40, 50, 60 years or so. And this dramatic increase in productivity has a lot to do not just with, or actually it's not just with coarse grain, but with all fruits, vegetables, grains, everything. We're seeing a dramatic increase in productivity over time, and that has to do with something called the Green Revolution, which occurred in the 1950s, 1960s, and basically kind of like the Industrial Revolution, but for farming. Changed everything from smaller scale farms to larger scale farms and mechanizing the farms using fertilizers and irrigation, genetically modified crops, as well as pesticides. And there are positives and negatives to each one of these facets of the Green Revolution, but all of them are partially responsible for this increase in productivity that we see in agriculture throughout the world. So I'm going to break down each one of these. We'll just do the first three today, and the next video we'll do the following two. So mechanization is extremely important for the development of larger scale farms using large tractors and combines. Allows farmers to have farms on massive scales. Otherwise, if they're just picking things by hand, they just possibly can't work an area of land that large. What that is going to mean is it leads to increased profits and increased efficiency. So more food produced, which is great for the requirements of the human population, also means more profits and arguably less work for the farmers. Small farms can't afford the upfront cost for these expensive equipment, which is one sort of prohibitive factor for mechanization, and it does mean that there's an increased reliance on fossil fuels for the farm industry. So those are two drawbacks. But what we do see is that because of mechanization in the 1950s and 60s, the average farm size increased dramatically, going from about 150 acres to close to 500 acres by the time we get to the late 90s. So mechanization does allow for increased farm size. And if we look at this chart here, we're looking at the average farm size in different areas of the world. In the US, the average farm size is 178 hectares. We have the largest farm sizes on average, with less than 2% of our 4% of our farms being less than 2%. Sorry, let me rephrase that. With 4% of our farms being less than 2 hectares. Whereas if you look in other areas of the world, they have much smaller farms, and a majority of their farms are smaller than 2 hectares. Another pattern that we see with large mechanization is this phenomenon of monocropping, which is basically the idea that you're growing one specific species of crop, and that's more efficient and economical because all your tools, your irrigation, your pesticides, your fertilizers, your plowing and tilling and seeding and harvesting can all be standardized for one crop. So it makes standardization really, really easy. There are a lot of drawbacks, however. This is going to deplete the soil of nutrients, and a decreased biodiversity means they're going to be exposed to things like pests and fires and diseases. Think back to the Irish potato famine. If you only grow one type of potato, you're more likely to have your crop be taken out by a disease. Some solutions to sort of push back against monocropping is basically the opposite, polyculture, which is basically growing multiple different types of crops and rotating your crops so that way you replenish soil nutrients. We'll talk about more of this next week when we learn about sustainable farming. And of course, agriculture is going to have environmental impacts like the Dust Bowl, and we talked about, especially when we look at mechanization and monocropping on large scales. Plowing and tilling the soil turns over the soil, and it kills a lot of the biota in the soil, the weeds, the insects. It compacts the soil, which is going to reduce the porosity and permeability. It's going to crush microbes that help cycle nutrients. It will loosen the soil and increase erosion from wind and rain, and ultimately will lead to soil degradation. Additionally, practices like slash and burn can be hugely detrimental for the ecosystem. we've talked about this before, but by burning the forest, not only are you removing a carbon sink, but you're also releasing carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide, which can exacerbate climate change. And the loss of the trees and the root structure can lead to erosion, and lack of roots to hold the topsoil together leads to more erosion, which makes it harder for plants to establish. That's a feedback loop we've talked about before. And additionally, once they slash and burn this area, it requires a lot of irrigation, because there's less water in the air because there are no plants there now, less transpiration, so they need a lot of irrigation, which can actually, if they irrigate too much, it can waterlog the soil, and in some cases the water can evaporate and leave behind a lot of salts, which can salinize the soil, which is also bad for plants. And multiple of those things combined can lead to the formation of deserts, so the land is completely unproductive. We see that a lot happening in the Amazon, where after these slash and burn farms are done, after a couple generations of farming, they don't turn back into rainforest, they turn into a savanna or a desert. So that was all kind of about mechanization. A second thing that we see, a second phenomenon we see arising during the Green Revolution are fertilizers. And fertilizers are hugely important. Basically, it's a concentrated solution that contains important nutrients for plants, mostly nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, NPK. And this is going to help plants grow and help them grow more efficiently. It can be synthetic or it can be organic. It's inorganic or synthetic fertilizer usually comes out of a bag. It's some sort of chemical pellets, whereas organic fertilizer is usually like manure or decomposed biotic tissue. And synthetic fertilizers are what are used for the most part on large agricultural scales, because it's easily applied, it's easily absorbed, and you can actually target your fertilizers based on the plants that you're growing. So if one plant needs a little bit more nitrogen than other plants, you can use a different synthetic fertilizer that will more fit the needs of the plant that you were growing. So that makes synthetic fertilizer really possible. And without synthetic fertilizers, we wouldn't be able to feed the world. We use a ton of fertilizer in the world, but also in the United States. And thanks to a man named Fritz Haber, he developed this process that allow us to fix nitrogen sort of artificially, and which helped us create synthetic fertilizers, which we use to feed the world. So he's responsible for feeding and saving hundreds of thousands of lives through his development of this Haber process. Coincidentally, and perhaps ironically, he's also responsible for many deaths, as he helped develop some of the poisonous gases that were used to execute people during the Holocaust in the concentration camps. So he's got a very checkered past, very interesting, the impacts that he's had on the human race. Synthetic fertilizers, of course, will have some environmental drawbacks. Much like everything in this class, there are pros and cons. First of all, they're produced using fossil fuel energy, so that's increased dependence on fossil fuels and increased releasing of greenhouse gases like CO2, which contribute to climate change. These fertilizers can leach into groundwater that we drink, which is not good for humans to be ingesting fertilizer. And they can be carried by runoff if there's a lot of fertilizer on the farm and water comes along, rain comes along, and it carries this runoff, carries a fertilizer into nearby bodies of water. It can lead to algal blooms, a process known as eutrophication, and those algae basically suck out all of the oxygen in the aquatic ecosystem. We'll learn more about that later this year. And here's a nice little chart summarizing the impacts of synthetic fertilizer. And you could see that the fertilizer use since the Green Revolution has increased dramatically. This is a huge component of why we're seeing increased productivity with farming. It improves our yields, but this increased reliance on fertilizer is not sustainable. Nitrogen is a renewable resource because of the Haber process, but phosphorus and potassium are not. They come from rocks and from mining, and there's a limited resources of those. We can't manufacture those. And the third and final thing that I'm going to talk about today for the Green Revolution is irrigation. Irrigation is basically the targeted addition of water to increase the yield of crops. About 70% of all fresh water that is used on Earth is used for agriculture. Only about 20% is used for like using it around your home. Some of it's used for powering things, but most of it is used for watering crops. And this usually comes from groundwater that's underneath the ground. That's why it's called groundwater. And there are 4 different types of irrigation that you need to be responsible for. The first is furrow irrigation, where basically they plant their crops in a straight line, they dig a bunch of trenches, and they fill those trenches with water. This is how cotton is grown. It's very low effort to do this. It's very cheap. Only problem is the soil can be waterlogged, can lead to intense amounts of erosion, and as this water starts to evaporate, it will leave behind all the salt that's in the water, which can actually make the soil really salty. This is pretty inefficient in terms of water, saving water. About 35% of it is lost due to evaporation or to runoff. But it is very cheap and low effort. Here's another picture. The second type is flood irrigation. This is done for things like cranberries, almonds, and rice, where you basically flood the entire field full of water. It's really easy, it's really cheap, but we see the similar problems that we saw with furrow irrigation, where it leads to waterlogging of the soil, increased erosion. It can even lead to salinization, as a significant chunk of that water is going to evaporate or run off. So again, a lot of wasted water here. Here's another picture of a growing a rice crop via flood irrigation. The third type of irrigation is spray irrigation. This is probably the most common, and it's probably what you use to irrigate your lawn. Basically, you've got sprinklers, and it's more efficient. You see significantly less water loss than some of these flood and furrow, only 15 to 25%, depending on the setup. But it costs more money than those other approaches, and you need energy to run it. So you need some sort of electricity or pump or something to get this water to actually spray through the nozzle. So spray irrigation is probably the most common, but it's a good trade-off between environmentally sustainable and economically sustainable. And lastly is drip irrigation. Oh, that's not drip irrigation, wrong photos. Drip irrigation is where you've got a hose that goes through your garden, and basically you're slowly dripping water out through that hose at very targeted areas. This is the most efficient by far for water use. You only lose about 5% of the water to evaporation or runoff compared to 15, 20, 30, 40% of these other irrigation types. The only problem is it costs a lot of money to set this up, and these hoses might need to be removed if you want to plow the land. Here's another picture of drip irrigation. You've got a hose running in between your rows of crops, and you poke holes in the hose that provide targeted water. So there are, of course, drawbacks to irrigation as a whole. First of all, it can deplete the aquifer. So a great example is the Ogallala Aquifer, which is the largest aquifer in the world. It's located under Nebraska and Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. And that aquifer is sinking because it's decreasing because we're taking so much of that fresh water out to irrigate the crops, but a lot of it is being wasted because we're using things like furrow and flood irrigation. It can also rob downstream areas of water. If we are taking the water out of the river or the groundwater to water our crops, downstream areas might dry out. It can lead to increased erosion and pollution, like I was talking about with eutrophication. And if you over-irrigate, it can waterlog the soil, which means that the roots of the plants aren't going to be able to get enough oxygen, so they might actually suffocate. And lastly, I mentioned this before already, salinization. Basically, the groundwater that we're pulling up and using to irrigate our crops, it contains minerals and salts, and as that water evaporates, it's going to leave those minerals and salts behind, and that can lead to buildup of salt and minerals in the soil. So you can get really sort of salty soil here. And too much of that left behind can be toxic for plant growth. So as water evaporates, it's going to leave that salt behind. Or if your farm, for some reason, is near the coast, and you've got the ocean there, you might have salt water intruding from the ocean. Okay, so that's enough for today. Next time I will talk about pesticide use and genetically modified organisms and how those impact the green revolution. If you've got questions, let me know.